Panama has amazing, astonishing potential. It's at the center of the world's greatest trade hub. You can't imagine what that should mean for Panamanian wealth. You know, I came into Panama overland from Costa Rica, Puerto Viejo, and on the bus was a young German couple traveling through Central America. And they said to me as we got into Panama, we're shocked. We thought Panama was an advanced country. This looks like Nicaragua. Panama, at the center of the world's greatest trade hub, can do so much better for its citizens. First, I'm going to give you a preview of the impact of economic freedom. These are snapshots in time, but the story they tell is based on solid research. The countries with the highest level of economic freedom, the top quarter, have an average per capita income of over $35,000 a year. The least free have an average per capita income of under $5,000 a year. Panama actually, even though it's a little bit higher than this in economic freedom, fits into the third quintile with an average per capita GDP of under $10,000 a year. Now, why is economic freedom so important? Well, a century of experience and much research shows that the drive and ingenuity of individuals and families beats government planning or crony capitalism hands down every day of the week. And economic freedom is the way to unleash that potential. This is the growth in developing nations by a quartile. And as you can see, the most free nations economically grow at over 3% a year. The least free grow at under 1% a year. So let's look at the world's greatest trading centers. Hong Kong, first in the world in economic freedom. Singapore, second in the world for economic freedom. So where do you think Panama, at the center of even greater trading hub, lies? 67th in economic freedom, between Zambia and Malaysia. Hong Kong has an average per capita income of around $35,000, and it was once one of the poorest places on earth. Singapore has about the same per capita income. Panama is way, way down there despite its potential, with an average per capita GDP of under $10,000 a year. Now let's look at their rankings in economic freedom. As mentioned, Hong Kong with a ranking of almost 9, and Panama with a ranking of over 8.5 are number 1 and number 2 in the world. Panama is way down, 67th at 7th. Well, maybe it's that Hong Kong and Singapore's great trading hubs have always been rich. That's the growth of Singapore in per capita GDP since 1960. What you'll notice is Panama starts at almost the same place. And while Panama seems to go nowhere, Singapore is going nothing but up. Hong Kong, we don't have data all the way back to 1960, but you can see it follows the same pattern as Singapore. That's the pattern Panama could follow, creating great prosperity for its citizens if you freed up the economy and made the appropriate reforms. Well, maybe it's because Panama didn't control the Panama Canal. So the handover is in 2000. Growth seems to be slightly better since then, but not much. Since 2000, Singapore's economy has grown by 82%. Hong Kong's economy by over 47%. Panama's economy, since the handover, has only grown by 39% in the past 10 years. That's an unfortunate record, again, for a country with the potential of Panama. But there is a magic cure to Panama's problems. But we're going to leave that until a little bit later and talk about why economic freedom is important and what it is. The project is now over 25 years old. It was an attempt to measure, we talk about political freedoms, we talk about social freedoms, yet it's the economic sphere that involves us most on a day-to-day basis. The goal was to establish a way to measure economic freedom. The research phase involves 60 of the world's top scholars, including 3 Nobel laureates. We now look at 42 different government policies and rank 152 nations. And we now have a collaboration of institutes in over 85 nations and territories. What is economic freedom? Individuals have economic freedom when the property they acquire without the use of force, fraud, or theft is protected from physical invasions by others, and they are free to use, exchange, or give their property as long as their actions do not violate the identical rights of others. We look at the size of government and taxation. The room for free exchange for economic freedom is reduced if government taxes away too much of your income or property, and if government uses up too much of the economic space, limiting the space for free exchange. Private property and the rule of law, this is probably the single most important area. Private property and the rule of law are the infrastructure of economic freedom. Without the rule of law, the rich and the powerful will limit the economic freedom of the weak and the poor, and they will limit it to their disadvantage, but the rich and powerful's advantage. Sound money, meaning lack of inflation. Trade regulation and tariffs. You should be able to buy and sell from anybody in Panama. You should be able to buy and sell from anybody in the world. Regulation of business, labor, and capital markets. You should be able to start a business when you want and close it when you want. Hire whom you want, work for whom you want. Fire your employees if need be, or quit your job if you wish. You should be able to borrow from whom you wish and lend to whom you wish. In other words, you should have economic freedom. The dynamics of economic freedom. Let me try to explain why this is so important for a society. The first of these is more crucial in, say, the Arab world than it is in Panama. Economic freedom changes social dynamics. Without economic freedom, with government or crony capitalists controlling who gets benefits and who doesn't, you set ethnic group against ethnic group as each party strives to get power so they can reap the benefits from government. That sets group against group. It creates a horrible dynamic, a dynamic now playing out in many Arab countries. But when you have economic freedom, people from other groups become your customers, your employees, your employers, your supplier, even other business people with common interests. In other words, you start cutting across ethnic and group lines. This doesn't create a miracle of tolerance overnight, but if you look at economically free countries, their tolerance levels are much elevated above those nations without economic freedom. It leads to other freedoms and democracy. If government controls your ability to get a job, to make a living, to feed and clothe your family, to get a promotion, even to travel, government has all the tools it needs to suppress dissent, at least until the anger gets too great. And finally, and this is the most important thing for Panama, it changes the economic dynamic. In a non-economically free country, it's who you know or which group you're with or what power you have that determines if you are prosperous or not. You get prosperous actually by making other people worse off because you're rent-seeking or you're trying to grab whatever benefits you can from government to others' disadvantage. In an economically free society, a truly economically free society, you can only get ahead by making goods and services other people want to buy. In other words, you can only get ahead by making other people better off by producing something that they want at a price they want. This also changes social dynamics. Here's an early statement of this from John Constant, 1861. Commerce inspires in men a vivid love of individual independence. Commerce supplies their needs, satisfies their desires without the intervention of the authorities. Not only does it emancipate individuals, but by creating credit, it places authority itself in a position of dependence. Talk about making a difference. These are our global partners, all around the world, including here in Panama. Now that you've had a chance to read that, we are also now the subject of a major documentary that's been aired on public television in the United States and around the world. You can look it up at changinglivesfilm.com. Economic freedom audits, translation, subnational and regional indexes. This is the report Fundación Libertad produced. It is an excellent description of the Panamanian economy, and Cristina will be following up today with solid recommendations on how to move forward with this. I'm sure you all read Arabic. This is our economic freedom audit of Lebanon, economic freedom audit of Côte d'Ivoire. By the way, it's interesting. We've done about a dozen economic freedom audits around the world. That is looking at all the policies in those 42 different areas. And the two groups that have done it the best in the world are one here in Panama with the Fundación Libertad and two in Côte d'Ivoire. Economic freedom of the Arab world, economic freedom of North America, Mexican states, India, and economic freedom translation into Spanish, German states. So we'll quickly take a look at the economic freedom of the world results. This is economic freedom over time. And as you can see, from 1975 onwards, economic freedom was on a increase, and it's leveled out a bit. But here's the interesting thing. As economic freedom went up across the globe, poverty went down across the globe for the reasons that I mentioned. Now people will say, economic freedom, free markets, that's fine, yes, it produces wealth, but only for the wealthy. So let's look at distribution. Oh, I'm sorry. This is a repeat of the slide earlier just to reinforce the relationship between economic freedom and prosperity. Now we'll look at distribution. This is interesting. This is not what I would have liked to see, but it's what occurs. The percentage of income received by the poorest 10% tends not much to be affected by economic freedom. In other words, economic freedom does not increase inequality, but it's not a cure for inequality. However, here is the miracle. Because economic freedom creates so much more prosperity, the same share of national income for the poorest 10% produce in the economically freest nations, this is the poorest 10%, in the economically freest nations, their average income is $10,000 a year. Do you know what that means? That means that the average income of Panamanians, the average income of all Panamanians, is below the income of the poorest 10% in the most economically free nations. That's a horrible statistic for Panama. And the poorest 10% in the least free nations gain under $1,000 a year. So in other words, the poorest of the poor are 10 times richer in economically free nations than in non-economically free nations. Economic freedom and political rights, I mentioned earlier why economic freedom tends to generate other freedoms in democracy, because it frees the individual from dependence on government. Economically free nations have much higher political rights than non-economically free nations. Same with civil rights. Corruption. Corruption tends to collapse in economically free countries. Wouldn't you like to see corruption collapse in Panama? And why does it collapse? When you are not economically free, when you need somebody's permission, the government's permission, or a crony capitalist's permission, or a powerful person's permission, when you need somebody's permission to do something, there's someone to pay off. If you don't need anybody's permission to do anything, if you're economically free, there's no one to pay off, except maybe yourself, but there's no one to pay for that permission. Economic freedom on other indicators of well-being. This is fascinating. This is economic freedom and life satisfaction, often also in the research literature called happiness. You know, our friends on the left were trying for a while to say, well, economic freedom, free markets may create prosperity, but what we really want is happiness. And how can people be happy with free markets when they could have a benevolent government looking after them and telling them what to do? Wouldn't that make you happy? Well, as it turns out, economic freedom is also a predictor of life satisfaction and happiness. It's not entirely clear why, because the research can tell you that economic freedom causes happiness. It can't tell you exactly why. But what the researchers think is going on is when you have control over your own life, when you can make your own economic decisions, when you can get ahead through your own effort and ingenuity, when you can help out your family, that in itself makes you happier. Literacy. Without economic freedom, you tend to be stuck wherever you are. Education may not be that important. With economic freedom, when you can follow your own path, your future potential is immense. Education becomes much more valuable, and you see higher levels of education in the most economically free societies, and perhaps even more important, you see more equal education between men and women, males and females. Now, looking around the room with so many young people, this may not interest you so much, but for gray hairs like myself, this is a pretty important chart. It means that if you're born in a non-economically free country, your life expectancy is only a little over 55 years of age. If you're born in an economically free country, with the prosperity and opportunity and hope that creates, Your life expectancy average is over 75 years of age. So how does Panama claim its potential? How do you raise your income in Panama? Not doubled, not tripled, but how do you raise it 5 times? How do you multiply people's income in Panama by 5? Well, first let's look where Panama is. This is economic freedom overall, and we're comparing Panama to some places. Central America, as you can see, on the whole, Central America does not do all that well. In fact, it is one of the places in the world that has the least level of economic freedom, and you can tell that from average incomes here. This is Singapore. You can see the big gap between Singapore and the average Latin American country. And I've already shown you the wealth differential. This is Chile, one of the world's great performers in economic freedom. This is the world average, and that's Panama. Now, Panama, in other words, is only at the Latin American average, vaguely over the world average, but take a look at that chart and you'll see something very interesting. All those other examples either have had a stable level of economic freedom over the past decade, or they've increased, if only slightly. Panama's the outrider. Panama's sliding downhill. Panama's moving away from prosperity. Size of government. Your government keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. You know, I've been told that in your presidential election, all 3 candidates are falling over themselves to give your money away to somebody else. In English, it's called robbing Peter to pay Paul. Mario Vargas Llosa, on the Peruvian election, famously said that the choice between the 2 candidates in the Peruvian election was a choice between cancer and AIDS. Well, you have 3 candidates. It seems like you have a choice between cancer, AIDS, and Alzheimer's. Now, as somebody said to me, they'd pick Alzheimer's because at least they wouldn't know what was going on as you declined. This is the key area. Here we start getting into the miracle. This is Panama, a horrible record in the rule of law. And that's most devastating for the poor. When there's a bad rule of law, the rich and the powerful can take advantage of the system through payoffs, through connections, through manipulation. And who are the victims? The poorest and the weakest of the population. And Panama's record here is dismal. Economic freedom and sound money. Again, there's concern because Panama keeps sliding downhill here. You're going away from a better country. Economic freedom and the freedom to trade. Panama gets a fairly good score here, but as the center of one of the world's great trading hubs, it shouldn't have a good score. It should have a brilliant score. Economic freedom and regulation, another just horrible score. Most countries in the world are poor. Panama shows itself at the same level in regulation as the world average and as the Latin American average. In other words, individuals and business people trying to get out in the labor force or establish a business get tied up in red tape. Maybe that's why I labeled Panama as red here. Magic solution, improve the rule of law. And this would be not just something that would increase economic freedom, not just something that would increase prosperity. This is something that would give new hope and opportunity to the poorest of the people in Panama if they could get a fair shake in the rule of law, if they could protect their property through the rule of law. Judicial independence, again, we have the same comparisons. Panama in judicial independence is way below the world, is way below the Central American average, way below the world average. This is a disastrous score. Impartial courts, a little bit better, but still way below where it should be. Property rights, again, a little bit better, but not close to where it should be. Military interference, well, that is something that Panama seems to have resolved. Integrity of the legal system, look how low that score is compared to the world. Enforcement of contracts, what economic historians and statisticians have discovered is that fair enforcement of contracts is one of the key things to building prosperity and growth, because if you make a contract and you can't be sure it'll be enforced, or if somebody can buy off the courts or manipulate the legal system, then you don't make investments, you don't create jobs, you don't create wealth. Restrictions on the sale of real property. This is again one of the few areas where Panama does reasonably well. Police reliability. Police reliability should be at least 2 points higher. Costs of crime. That's a very sad number. The costs of crime, the low score indicates that the costs of crime here are very high. So overall, that's where Panama stands in the rule of law. So what is the magic? If you can bring the rule of law in Panama up to the same level as the other areas of economic freedom, you create magical results. Now remember, I'm just talking about I told you there are 5 areas to economic freedom. I'm talking about dropping the rule of law and taking the average of the other 4 and then putting the rule of law where that would be. Just bringing it up to the average of the other 4. Here's what happens. Current ranks, the red line, is where Panama is now, 67th. Establish a reliable rule of law that equals Panama's other scores, and that's where you soar to. What a change in neighborhood. Panama's score goes from 7.1 to 7.7. That might not seem like a lot, but it makes a huge difference. Panama's rank goes from 67th to 17th. That's where the wealthy nations are, in the top 20. If you could just improve your rule of law, you'd be in the top 20. Panama's neighbors in score in rank in the current index with your current level of the rule of law are great places like Fiji, Uganda, Zambia, Malaysia, Mongolia, Turkey. Those are your neighbors in the economic freedom score. Improve the rule of law, and your neighbors become the United States, Germany, Cyprus, Estonia, a star of growth in Europe right now, Taiwan and Denmark. That's an immense change in neighborhood for Panama, and you can do it by improving the rule of law, and that won't cost you a cent. You just have to figure out one of the most complicated questions in the world, and that's how to do it. But it's free if you figure out how to do it. And as I said, it is a particular benefit to the poor and dispossessed, because a weak legal system can be manipulated by the rich and powerful, used to exclude the poor and the weak, create permanently excluded groups. without the rule of law, and without economic freedom, if you're born poor, you tend to remain poor. If you're born wealthy, you tend to remain wealthy. With economic freedom and the rule of law, you're born poor and you have the chance of getting prosperous. You're born wealthy and you aren't any good or you're lazy, you might go down. But that's fairness. Well, I've used up my 30 minutes, so I won't go through the conclusions, other than to say that improved economic prosperity will allow improved economic freedom will allow Panama to claim its true potential. It should be one of the wealthiest nations on the planet. Instead, it is one of the poorest. All our research can be downloaded for free at these sites. Thank you very much.